What if the story you've been telling yourself about who's at fault is actually what's keeping you stuck? Is the harshest critic in your life not someone else, but your own voice inside your head? And what if letting go of blame, both toward others and toward yourself, is the one thing that could actually set you free? Listen in and learn to let go. This podcast is always 20 minutes or less, so you don't have to feel overwhelmed or overhaul everything in your life, but just make small, simple changes to create more calm and peace. To get to your better life, make small changes and begin to live it. Hey, welcome back, friends, or welcome, new friend, if you just started listening. Thank you for being here as we talk about blame and what it does to us emotionally in how our lives move forward. Blame can feel so good, and it's one of the most universally human things we do. And now, before you think, oh, good, this is the episode where I finally get validated for everything that person did to me. Well, maybe not, because we're going to go a little deeper than that today. Because blame is a two-sided coin, and most of us are spending way too much time on both sides of it without realizing what it's actually costing us. So let's start here. Blame feels good in the short term. It really does. There's an almost immediate relief that comes from locating the source of your pain outside of yourself. It's their fault. It's the situation. It's the way I was raised, the job I didn't get, the person who let me down, the circumstances that weren't fair. And sometimes, honestly, those things are real. People do let us down. Circumstances aren't always fair, and bad things happen that weren't our fault. And I'm not here to tell you that nothing is ever anyone else's responsibility. But what I'm here to talk about is what happens when blame becomes our default setting, when it becomes the story we tell ourselves automatically without identifying the source and being honest about our part in it. And blame doesn't actually do anything. It doesn't fix the problem, and it doesn't heal the wound. It doesn't move you forward. It just keeps you standing in the same spot, just pointing. And while you're pointing, any version of healing can't happen. All that energy going into the pointing, into the story, into the justification. Meanwhile, the hurt is just sitting there patiently, tapping its foot, waiting for you to put your arm down and heal. So take a moment right now and think about something you've been blaming lately. A person, a situation, maybe even yourself that you haven't been able to heal from. Just let it come up without judgment and think about this as you listen in today. I want to bring in something that tends to prevent this healing, and that's the ego. The Buddha described the ego as that which resists what is. And the ego is the part of you that pushes back and says, this shouldn't be happening. This isn't fair. This isn't who I am. This isn't my fault. It's the part of you that would rather construct a story than sit with an uncomfortable truth. And here's why that matters so much in the context of blame. When something goes wrong in our lives, when a relationship falls apart or a decision backfires, or we find ourselves in a situation we didn't want, there's a moment, just a brief one, where we have a choice. We can look inward and ask, what was my part in this? Or we can look outward and say, who or what caused this? And the ego, because it is fundamentally uncomfortable with vulnerability, almost always pushes us toward the second option. Because looking inward is hard. It requires us to sit with feelings we don't want, like regret, shame, and embarrassment. And vulnerability is something the ego absolutely cannot stand because it feels like exposure. So instead of feeling that, the ego builds a wall out of blame. Pointing outward feels so much safer than turning inward. And we do it so fast, so automatically, that most of the time we don't even catch ourselves doing it. Someone says something that stings, and before we've even consciously processed it, we're already constructing our defense, already deciding whose fault this is. And the really sneaky thing about the ego is that it's very convincing. It doesn't feel like avoidance when you're in it. It feels like clarity. It feels like finally seeing things as they really are. But that feeling of righteous certainty, that's often the ego at its most comfortable, keeping you safe with certainty, whether it's true or not. Now let's bring some research into this because it helps to know this isn't a character flaw. It's just actually basic wired human tendency. A study published in the Journal of Psychological Science found that people are significantly more likely to blame their failures on external causes and their successes to internal ones. And researchers call this the self-serving bias, and it's fairly consistent across cultures and age groups. In other words, we're basically all walking around with brains that are quietly running a PR campaign on our behalf, making sure we look good in our own internal narrative. But when we consistently locate the cause of our problems outside ourselves, we also accidentally hand over all of our power. If it's always someone else's fault, then the solution is always in someone else's hands. You become a passenger in your own life, waiting for other people to change, for circumstances to shift, for the world to finally be fair enough that things start going your way. And that is an exhausting and disempowering place to live. That feeling of waiting, of things being almost right, except for that one person or that one situation that just won't cooperate. What's really important about this is when we give away responsibility, we also give away agency. And agency, the belief that our choices and actions actually matter and can change things, is one of the most significant predictors of well-being and life satisfaction that researchers have found. People who believe they have an influence over their own lives consistently report greater happiness, better health outcomes, and stronger relationships than those who feel like life is just happening to them. So blame, as comfortable as it feels in the moment, is actually quietly eroding that well-being or preventing it from even being felt. Now let's talk about the flip side of this, about what happens when we blame ourselves. Not in a reflective, growth-oriented way, but in a kind of way that's actually just another form of avoiding the truth. Because there's a version of self-blame that sounds like accountability, but it's actually just cruelty dressed up as internal knowledge. It's the inner voice that says, "You're so stupid. How could you have done that? You deserve what you got. Of course this happened because you're not enough. You never learn. You always do this." And that voice, I know a lot of us know that voice. It's not the voice of growth. It's not wisdom and it's not honesty. It's the voice of ego collapsing inward instead of outward, but it's still avoiding the real hard work. Because real accountability, the kind that actually changes things, doesn't sound like "I'm stupid and I deserve this." Real accountability sounds like "I made a choice that didn't serve me, and I want to understand why so I can do something different next time." There's no spiral in that. There's just honesty and curiosity and the quiet intention to learn. And I think it's worth asking, why do we do the harsh version? Why, when we make a mistake, do so many of us go straight to the cruelest possible interpretation of ourselves? Well, part of it is cultural. Many of us grew up in environments where being hard on yourself was equated with being responsible, where softness toward yourself was seen as making excuses, where the louder and more harshly you criticized yourself, the more it proved you understood the seriousness of what you've done. But criticism isn't the same as understanding, and shame isn't the same as growth. They just feel similar from the inside because they're both uncomfortable. So think about that and be honest with yourself. When you make a mistake, what does your internal voice actually sound like? Is it the voice of a wise, caring friend, someone who loves you and wants the best for you? Or is it something harsher, more impatient, and less forgiving? A study from the University of California, Berkeley, found that people who practice self-compassion after failure, meaning they treat themselves with the same kindness that they'd offer a good friend, are actually more likely to take personal responsibility for their actions than people who engage in harsh self-criticism, which is the opposite of what most of us assume. We think being hard on ourselves keeps us accountable and motivated, but the research says it actually makes us more defensive and more likely to avoid looking at our part in things, because the shame becomes so overwhelming that we can't bear to look at it directly. Self-compassion, on the other hand, creates enough psychological safety that we can actually examine what happened clearly and honestly without needing to run from it or bury it under more self-attack. So whether we're blaming outward at other people or blaming inward with cruelty toward ourselves, both versions are essentially doing the same thing. They're protecting us from discomfort of sitting with reality as it actually is. Viktor Frankl, a psychiatrist and Holocaust survivor, wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." Blame in all its forms is a way of avoiding that challenge. It's the ego saying, "I don't want to change. I want someone or something else to be different so I don't have to be." And the ego is very persuasive about this. It will remind you of every unfair thing that ever happened, and it will feel completely reasonable. That's how good the ego is at its job. So let's talk about what it actually looks like to step out of blame and find real growth towards healing. The first thing, and I think the most important, is to get curious instead of defensive. When something goes wrong, instead of immediately asking whose fault is it, try asking what happened here and what was my part in it. Not all of it, just your part. Because even in situations where someone else genuinely did something wrong, there's almost always something in there that belongs to you too. A boundary you didn't hold, a choice you made, a pattern you've been carrying around for years without really examining it. And owning that part, just your part, is where your power actually lives. This isn't about letting other people off the hook. It's about unhooking yourself. There's a really important difference between those two things. You can absolutely acknowledge that someone else behaved badly and still ask yourself, what do you want to do with that information and how you want to move forward? One is about them, the other is about you. And remember, you're the only one you actually have any control over. So think about a situation in your life right now where maybe you've been holding blame either toward someone else or toward yourself. What would it feel like to just take your part of it back? Not all of it, just yours. Own it without cruelty and decide what you want to do with it from here. Not what they should do, not what should have happened differently, just what you need to do to help move through the situation. That's where the freedom starts. The second thing I want to offer is the practice of sitting with discomfort instead of immediately reaching for a story. Because blame is really just a story we tell to make the discomfort stop as quickly as possible. And the discomfort, as unpleasant as it is actually the path. It's where the real information lives. When we feel the sting of embarrassment, or that pang of regret, or that tight, anxious feeling of having contributed to something we didn't want, those feelings aren't enemies. They're data. They're the nervous system's way of saying, hey, pay attention here. There's something worth understanding. And I know sitting with discomfort isn't exactly anyone's idea of a good time. Blame has a clear villain and a clear victim, and it's a satisfying narrative story that lets you off the hook emotionally. But the story isn't always true, and it's almost never useful in the long run. The story might feel good tonight, but it doesn't actually take you anywhere new. You wake up tomorrow in the same spot with the same unresolved thing sitting there waiting. The third thing to practice is what I'd call honest compassion, which means telling yourself the truth about your part in something while also being genuinely kind to yourself in the telling. Not the sugar-coated, everything is fine, nothing to see here version, and not the you're terrible and you should have known better version either. Somewhere in the middle is the honest, warm, you're a human being who made a very human choice, and here's what you might want to do differently next time version. That voice is available to all of us, and it just takes practice to find it and use it, and even more practice to trust it, to trust ourselves. And here's what I really want you to understand about all of this. Stepping out of blame, whether it's blame of others or blame of yourself, isn't about becoming someone who never makes mistakes or never feels wronged. That person doesn't exist. It's about becoming someone who can look at their life with clear and kind eyes. Someone who can say, here's what happened. Here's what I brought to it. Here's what I want to do better. Here's how I want to move instead. That kind of self-awareness is genuinely life-changing. And of course, not overnight, but as we're always saying here, it's the little changes, the little shifts in mindset that moves you forward. Blame keeps you in the past. It keeps you rehearsing what went wrong, who did what, and what should have been different. And while you're back there rehearsing the past, the present, which is the only place where anything can actually change anything, is happening right around you. Staying present, peeling back the layers of all that protection, and looking truly with an open and honest mind, as hard as it can feel, will move you forward. And as the saying goes, you have to feel it to heal it. And what we're talking about today is to feel the whole story, not just parts, the whole thing without blame of others and without blame of yourself. And let's not forget to address others who may blame you for their actions, their decisions. Sometimes the guilt you feel for your part can keep you stuck in their blame shift, but you can only own and learn from your part. If they refuse to own theirs, a couple things you can say is, I understand you're saying this, but how does that relate to my actions? Or, I understand you feel that way, but I'm not responsible for your decisions. And ultimately, you have to protect your peace. So if this person is unwilling to stop the blame shift and see their part, you may have to step back from the relationship. You might say, I hear you're still really angry about this, so I think it might be best for me to give you time and space to process how you need to heal from this and move forward. So for yourself, though, here's something to try this week. The next time you catch yourself in a blame spiral, whether it's pointing outward at someone else or inward at yourself with unkindness, just pause. You don't have to fix anything in that moment. Just notice the story you're telling. Ask yourself if it's the whole truth. Ask yourself what you might be protecting yourself from feeling if you just loosened your grip on that story even just a little. And then be genuinely gentle with whatever comes up, because what comes up is almost always something very human and very understandable. We're all just doing our best with what we learned and what we have. And the fact that you're here listening to this, thinking about these things, that already says you want to learn a different way. You want to learn about yourself. And maybe you're thinking about one person in your life who might really need to hear this conversation. So please share it with them. Not because they have a blame problem, but because they're human and they're doing their best. And sometimes we all need permission to put down the story we've been carrying. And you might be the reason someone has a genuinely different week. So let's close with this. You don't have to have it all figured out today. You don't need to have mastered the ego or achieved some perfectly blame-free existence. What you need is just a little more willingness than yesterday, a tiny bit more curiosity than defensiveness, a little bit more kindness toward yourself than criticism, and then let that build. Every time you choose curiosity over blame, even just once, even imperfectly, you're rewiring something. And over time, that rewiring becomes a different default. It becomes the life you're wanting to live, little by little and piece by piece. This podcast is based on my own life experiences. I'm not a therapist, a psychologist, psychiatrist, or any other licensed medical professional. Please share this podcast with anyone you think needs to hear this so that we all move forward, little by little and piece by piece. And thank you, Purple Planet, for sharing your music. Please follow and leave a 5-star review if you can. It really does matter.